While John's mending his organ, let's get a rhythm going here. All right. This is how it goes. In a minute, we're going to have a few breaks, and I want you to keep on clapping all the way through. All right. Yeah. Ow! Come on now. Like rhythm and blues as well, if you like categories.
Come on! Space Truckin' was by this time the longest number in the set and gave Ritchie Blackmore a chance to stretch out. Blackmore was born in Weston-super-Mare on the 14th of April 1945, though he was brought up in Heston in Middlesex, Greater London. His first group was a skiffle band at school that took its name from the infamous Two Eyes coffee bar in London. Seeing Tommy Steele on TV, Ritchie got his father to buy him an acoustic guitar, and he took classical lessons for a year or so. He also had lessons from Big Jim Sullivan, who lived nearby. On leaving school, Ritchie got himself a job servicing aircraft radios at Heathrow Airport, whilst also playing in semi-pro bands after he'd bought himself a cherry red Gibson ES335 electric guitar. After a UK tour supporting Johnny Bennett and Gary U.S. Bonds in 1962, and still only 16 years old, Ritchie landed a job with Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages, at which point he turned professional. Originally shy on stage, Sutch stressed the importance of putting on a performance, and through this, Ritchie learned the importance of showmanship as much as musicianship. Later in the year, he joined the Outlaws, a well-established instrumental group who were signed to Britain's most successful independent producer, Joe Meek. As well as recording and touring in their own name, the Outlaws were the house band in Meek's Holloway Road studio and appeared on countless recordings over the next 2 years by artists such as Mike Berry, Freddie Starr, John Layton, Tom Jones and Hines, amongst others. The Outlaws also toured the UK and Germany with Gene Vincent and Jerry Lee Lewis. Ritchie learned from Gene Vincent how to enjoy the often long journeys from town to town on tour, and soon became an expert at firing gooseberries from a catapult or throwing bags of flour at passing pedestrians. In 1964, Ritchie joined Hines's new group, the Wild Boys, and recorded a solo single that sold so few copies that it's now an incredibly rare and collectible item. The number of sessions with Meek dwindled, and after a tour with Neil Christian, Ritchie moved to Germany. It was whilst he was living there in late 1967 that he got a cable inviting him to join what would become Deep Purple. Space Truckin' the track had been laid down during the Machine Head sessions, which famously took place in Montreux, Switzerland. They were due to record at the casino, but the place burnt to the ground during a show by Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. They tried again at the Pavilion, but were soon moved out after complaints about the noise, finally settling on the Grand Hotel. As opposed to the long drawn-out process of recording the previous 2 albums, in just over 2 weeks they laid down 8 new tracks and produced what would go on to be their biggest selling album. And despite the workload, they still found time to fly back to Britain to make their last appearance on the BBC's Top of the Pops, miming to the single Fireball. On disc, Space Truckin' is a short, punchy track with lots of nifty percussion work and some great 50s-inspired lyrics about space travel. On stage, a lot of the clever production effects could not be replicated, and the track gets a harder edge. It also got longer. A lot longer. Deep Purple had always been about letting the 2 main soloists stretch out, and earlier tours by this lineup had included epics such as Mandrake Root and Wring That Neck, which between them could stretch for 50 minutes or more. As they were phased out, they still wanted a number with plenty of room for improvisation, and whilst Lazy originally bridged this gap on the UK Fireball tour, often extending beyond 20 minutes, during the North American tour in January 1972, Space Truckin' was added to the set. The number gets a long middle section during which Gillan returns to his congas, and is then wrapped up with the closing sequence from Mandrake Root, a track which had been dropped from the live show just prior to the UK Fireball tour. At this point, Blackmore often went into his strobe sequence, throwing his guitar into the air and generally mistreating it in a climactic sequence that left the audience amazed. Occasionally, whether through sheer frustration or exuberance, the guitar might suffer much worse and end up in pieces, although the days when he would, or even could afford to buy in replicas to deliberately trash, was still some way off. Dismissed by some critics as copying from The Who, most tended to forget that Blackmore's career went back at least as far as Pete Townshend's, and incorporated spells with arguably Britain's most outrageous 1960s outfit, Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages. There, dressed in a loincloth or Roman toga, if Blackmore tried to hide behind his amps, Sutch dragged him into the limelight by his hair. Space Truckin' contains probably the best footage of the whole set, especially of Blackmore. Lord kicks in a couple of classical themes, Jupiter by Holst and Sabre Dance, as well as some strange improvising before Ritchie is let loose, giving his custom-made toughened tremolo arm a real mangling and getting into a touch of feedback. With Roger now on maracas, Blackmore tones it down a bit with a quiet solo leading into the Fool's volume control sequence. There is one tremendous close-up shot of his face in absolute heaven. Eyes closed, head pressed up, his back against the Marshall cabinets as he lets the machine take him where it will. Then, sudden silence as the crowd is caught unawares, before erupting. Pace is looking about smiling. The band judge it just right as they crash back into the final climax. On earlier CD or vinyl releases, this can sound a real mess at times, but with the visuals, it all makes sense. Ritchie prowls about like an animal, as the two Ians both flail away in a massive hare. Without warning, Ritchie explodes into action and the black Stratocaster goes hurtling into the air above the camera and the crowd. He catches it, plays it with his backside and sets it on the stage for a quick foot dance before grabbing it up and signalling to John across the stage, hurling it around by the neck. It finally gets laid to rest on the amps, feeding back. The mood grips the rest of the band. On the other side of the stage, Roger is trying to push over his cabinets. Gillan shoves his congas over and John finishes the number with an almighty crashing chord. Having followed 1970s Deep Purple in rock with Fireball in 1971 and Machine Head in 1972, both of which sold just as well, it was Machine Head that broke the band in America, and they were set to spend most of 1972 touring the States. 6 separate tours in all. Much of the set we see here had developed over a 9-month period, and although the new album was still not released at this time, effectively the Fireball tour had evolved into the Machine Head tour by the end of February 1972. When Purple played 3 dates in England in February, they'd virtually settled upon what would prove to be the bulk of the set, if not the running order for the remainder of the year. Indeed, over 30 years on, many of these tracks still feature in the band's live set. The only question left unanswered here is what happened to Smoke on the Water? Well, at the time, it was just perceived as an album track of no greater significance than any of the others, and it hadn't been played live. The band were back in Britain the following week, and just 8 days after this show was filmed, they were in the BBC's Paris Theatre recording for the In Concert radio show. They played almost the entire Machine Head album, omitting only Pictures of Home, retaining Strange Kind of Woman in its place. Maybe I'm a Leo, Never Before, and Smoke on the Water were included as one-offs for this show. It was well received, but despite this, Smoke would not be played again until the two shows at the Rainbow over 3 months later. Happily, the number appears on the second feature on this DVD.
Thank you all very much. God bless you. Great to be back in Copenhagen. We'll see you around. Thank you. Good night. There you go. Thank you.
As the group leave the stage, the roadies had a few minutes' grace in which to sort things out for an encore. The band had issued Fireball as a single in the autumn of 1971 and had managed to score their third successive British singles chart hit with it, so it made inclusion in the stage act almost mandatory. To reproduce the studio drum sound, however, Ian Paice needed an extra bass drum, and this is set up by the road crew just as the band return to the stage, pointing towards John Lord rather than the audience. And though it's there just for this track, it's left in situ until the end of the encores.
Hey! All right, we're going to do a little bit of fun now. This is something we had as a record a little while ago, and so we've got plenty of time, don't worry about it. We'll be with you in a couple of seconds as soon as we get our instruments rebuilt and back. Hang on a second. Here's the thing.
Fireball here is not quite as hectic a version as some we've heard, and by Deep Purple standards, it's a fairly short number as well. But Ian Paice plays a blinder. Once the second bass drum is in place, he just goes berserk. The others look on in amazement, and it's some time before they latch on to the number. Richie struggles briefly at the start of this number as his guitar lead seems to be cutting out, disappointing the youngest fans that seem to have congregated around his side of the stage.